Ladies and gentlemen, a very, I think, warm welcome to this workshop on agent-based modelling and macroeconomics. My name's Angus Armstrong. I'm the director of the Rebuilding Macroeconomics Network, which is based at University College London, and we're delighted to co-host this afternoon's event with the Bank of England. I'm very grateful for them hosting us all here today. Rebuilding Macroeconomics has funded 35 research projects. We have about 100 discussion papers online. As far as I can count, we have past 60 peer-reviewed publications. So we've been around for a while. Our distinctive interest is that we are intrigued by how people make decisions in situations of a deep uncertainty or radical uncertainty. And people being different, an obvious thing to do is for people to interact. And that interaction, of course, can lead to lots of different possible outcomes. And we look at different tools to help us understand these possible outcomes. Agent-based modeling is one of the most established ways, which is why we're so keen to have this workshop. One of the things that I've learned from agent-based modeling most recently is that it seems to be moving from rather an experimental side to much more a policy side. And so many of the applications are much more in the traditional fields of fiscal and monetary policy, but also the areas we're going to talk about today, innovation policy, which, as we know, is something which is hampering many governments about innovation and productivity, and the second half about interaction and heterogeneity. So my co-host, the Bank of England, I'm going to ask Arzu to come up here and do the introductions, or staying there, or staying there on her behalf. But as I can finally say, we have a lot of people online. It's now open, and to use the chat box to ask questions in the Q&A session at the end of both of the session 1 and session 2, we'll read those questions out. So please use the chat box, and we will read them and relay those in the Q&A sections. Thank you very much indeed, and welcome to our speakers. And Arzu, over to you.
Many thanks, everyone, for your interest and being here. I'm Arzu Luch, a research advisor at the bank, and I'm
here. And they hear. Does it work? Your microphone.
Yes, there are some, but if there are some issues, please chat on the box. Yeah, it's working fine. Yeah, perfect. Okay, we get this signal. So I'm here with my colleague, Mark Hinterschweiger. Bank of England is co-organizing and hosting this event because we have a keen interest in exploring and using agent-based models to address some of the policy questions that we are facing. In recent years, there has been quite a few agent-based models developed at the bank, and some policy areas are open to add these models to their toolkits. And we are hoping that this workshop help us to build a network between Bank of England researchers and academics who are experts in this field, and also with other policy institutions as well. The event is going to focus on a recent book by Giovanni Dosi, as well as how agent-based models can illuminate analysis of technology, innovation, heterogeneity, interactions, and macroeconomic policy. So Giovanni is a professor and director at Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, and also co-directors of 2 task forces on intellectual property rights and industrial policy at the Columbia University. His research focuses on a variety of topics, but one of the key ones is economics of innovation and technological change. He is also well known with his contributions to complexity economics and agent-based modeling, and we are here to get insights from his recent book on the foundation of complex evolving systems. The first session will focus on innovation as an evolutionary process, and David Soskis will provide a discussion on the political economy of innovation following Giovanni's speech. David is an emeritus professor at LSE, and one of the topics that he's currently working is on tractable macroeconomic models. So it will be great to get his views. So in the first session, Giovanni will have about 45 minutes for his speech, and then we will have David for 15 minutes for discussion. Afterwards, we will open the floor for questions. But if you have a burning question, please, let us know on the chat box. Otherwise, we would like to keep it till the end. So there are a couple of housekeeping rules that I have to tell. So first of all, guests cannot move unescorted around the building. If at any point you wish to leave, please speak to a member of the Bank of England events team. There is no photography allowed when inside the building. However, you will be allowed to take pictures of the slides when you are in the auditorium. No food or drink is permitted in auditorium, including water. It will be only permitted at the top tables and the foyer area during breaks. And if the alarm sounds, then please follow a member of staff and you will be led to the front of the building and will be asked to move 400 meters away from the building. So today we don't have a planned test. So if it really goes off, that means that there's a real issue going on. So we have to leave immediately. Well, that's from me. It's a pleasure to have Giovanni and David here. And now I give the floor to John.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I will, thanks. I will go up and down with this. I want to take you through a quite long journey to get to macro and agent-based macro. The long journey will begin with what are essentially the basic question that political economy, since its inception, that by the way was not called political economy, but it was called moral philosophy at the time, was asking. And the entire manual to which I'm referring is a sort of invitation to go back at these questions and also look at micro, macro, etc., having in mind what we want to explain. What do we want to explain? I think the original objective, and that is still there, is understanding the emergence, structure, and dynamics of modern capitalist economies. That was what fascinated Adam Smith, what fascinated the classics. Note that this question is very different from the infamous definition by Lionel Robbins. Economics is about the allocation of scarce resources to alternative ends. It's totally different. And in fact, most of the contemporary economics is about allocation and not about dynamics. I shall come back to that. How do you answer the classical question? My suggestion is you've got to answer it in terms of understanding the economy as a complex evolving system. Then I need to have 5 minutes on what complex evolving systems are about. Bear with me, but I think it will be important for the rest of the discussion. Well, complex systems are interacting systems. Interaction means emergence. Emergence means that you cannot impute to the will or the decision of individual agents the collective outcome. That is, there is no isomorphism between macroscopic phenomena in our domain, the dynamics of industries, markets, or economies, and the behavior of individual entities. Flag here, double flag. I mean, this is the contrary to what has been going on in the last 40 years in economics, in which you had more and more the anthropomorphization, both in the common language and in the theory, especially macro theory. In common language, you read the market is nervous, the market is depressed, I mean, like it was a subject of psychiatry. And on the macro, you have got DSG that essentially assume that you can summarize the behavior of the entire market into some agent, or if it is not one, a couple more difficult, 3 or 4, that do extremely complicated calculation that not even the normal individual agent like us are generally able to do. I mean, so you assume that the market, a mystical market that is a person, is Mr. Market or Miss Market, is able to calculate, for example, transversality conditions, while you are unable to do it. This is mysticism, but complex system is against this type, is the opposite of this type of mysticism. Complexity is intimately related with nonlinearities, and thus with multiple dynamic paths. History counts. You've got path dependency. Recall that knowledge accumulation, innovation, information acquisition is an extreme form of dynamic increasing return. So an extreme form of nonlinearity. I mean, the best statement on that is by Canaro, 96, on industrial and corporate change. I asked him to write it down because we were talking about it over a glass of wine, and said, no, now you write it down. Because in a sense, it's the declaration of the death of general equilibrium. Because if you've got dynamic increasing returns, you lose convexity, etc., etc. Evolution in biology, and even more so in the socioeconomic domain, involves the emergence of new elements, new entities, new morphologies that emerge along the path that could not be there even potentially at the beginning. You've got the emergence of life, and then the emergence of multicellular entities, etc., etc. Evolution is a multi-scale phenomenon, both in biology and even more so in the socioeconomic domain. In biology, taxa are nested in ecologies, species, phenotypes, genes that co-evolve but at different rates. And more so in the socioeconomic domain, technologies, organizational forms, firms, institutions. As Phil Anderson, in a beautiful paper of 1972, Scientific American, short, 5 pages. More is different, was the general claim. Biology is not applied chemistry. Psychology is not applied biology. This means that you have got, going from one level to another, you have got not only phase transition, but for morphological phase transition. You have got new structure appearing. Note that in general, this is yet another parenthesis, I will open many parentheses. If you, in a system you've got phase transition, technically, it means that you've got a symmetry breaking, the physicists say. If you've got symmetry breaking, it means that often it is the tail of the distribution of something that leads the change. If you want to put it in terms of econometrics, the important part of what you observe is the error, not not the estimate, but is what you leave out because it's the error that drives the dynamics. With major implication, of course, that I'm not an econometrician, I leave it to you. And of general consideration. What about specific economics? What do we want to explain? Now, to repeat the question that in a little more detail that I was asking before, I think that there are three major questions. What are the drivers and pattern of change of the capitalist machine of production and innovation? What is the mechanism of imperfect coordination among a multitude of self-seeking agents, often characterized by conflicting interests? And third, as a consequence of the first two, why are some countries getting rich and some other remaining bloody poor? It is even important the order through which you ask this question. Adam Smith, rightly so in my view, begins with the first question. The wealth of nation begins with the pin factor. The pin factor is essentially a story of dynamic increasing returns. You've got division of labor increases productivity reduces prices, this enlarges the market, which allows further division of labor. Pure story of the dynamic increasing return. The infamous definition of the visible hand, he uses only once in book 4. Now, as you know, the modern contemporary research project starts from the opposite. General equilibrium is a beautiful attempt to say, I want to show coordination among independent agents under the most parsimonious set of assumptions concerning institutions. It should have been done, this attempt. It's a failure. And the first to admit it is Canaro himself. One should have tried it, but he's too fragile creature, and you cannot even demonstrate stability generically, local stability, let alone introduce innovation, let alone introduce this deep uncertainty. In fact, I mean, general equilibrium is intrinsically inconsistent with any innovative economy, because to have a general equilibrium, you need to have contingency markets, future contingency markets. But then an innovation is something that you don't know yet. So how can you have a future market of something that you don't know? You cannot say, I will sell you the day out of tomorrow if it rains X, but I cannot tell you what is X. Well, it would be difficult. Notice that the profession did not care about it and said, let's go on. A big challenge, on the contrary, for any theory, and I think theories that start with the first question before, try to explain a series of stylized facts at different level of aggregation. A curious episode. We were at Santa Fe, and in one of these evolution, the economy as a complex system, as a evolutionary system, a title very similar to the manual. They deliver much less than that, but in any case, after half a day, exactly, Phil Anderson, German, and another couple of distinguished physicists asked, we don't understand this, they said. What are you economists try to explain? The question was found by the majority of, especially the younger economists, quite bizarre. What do you mean? What do you say? And then Kenaro and myself went to a blackboard and for half a day wrote down on the blackboard the stylized facts that the economics should try to explain. This list is somewhat a sophistication on the list that Ken and I wrote on the blackboard. And essentially, there are 4 sets of long-term patterns: forging ahead, catching up, falling behind on a secular basis. Zooming in on that, the stylized facts, or maybe they're not stylized facts at all, the Kuznetian one on, for example, the balance between services, industry, agriculture, or in terms of income growth and income distribution, which, by the way, should be deeply rechecked. Kaldorian stylized fact, again, to be checked on capital output ratio, relationship between wages and productivity, and macro patterns, trends, fluctuation, crisis, and quite frequent involuntary unemployment. It is a very bad epistemology trying to tackle one stylized fact at a time. If you don't do it with a theory that is able to account for a lot of the other ones. And I will argue, especially in the second part of this conversation, that agent-based models are precisely able to account for a long list of stylized facts at different level of aggregation. I mean, when someone gives me a weird theory, especially in macroeconomics, and tells me, but this explains, say, fluctuations. I keep thinking of, there was a theory of astronomical theory in the Middle Ages in Byzantium, saying that why do you have the day and night? Because God opens and closes the curtains of the world. Now, and they were making also sophisticated calculation that were reasonably adequate. But of course, it's not a theory that was taken seriously by Galileo, Copernicus, Newton, because it was inconsistent with anything else on Earth. It seems to me that many theories nowadays are like God opening and closing the curtain of the universe. Now, getting nearer the answer and also nearer my book, what are the major building blocks of this interpretation, the way I see it, and in the book, in the manual, we argue it in the first historical chapter, wrote on the ground of a beautiful paper by Chris Freeman, wrote in '95 and never published. Well, essentially, smooth period of growth, or on the contrary, period of crisis, fragility of the system, have to do with the matching or the mismatching between, in the long term, the generation of scientific knowledge. That is a sort of the endless frontier, as Vannevar Bush wrote in 1945 in his fantastic report to the press that I suggested to read. Also in relation to what drives technical change in the long term. Then you've got the development of new artifacts and new techniques of production. That is the technological machine. Third, you have the economic machine, that is the organization of production and distribution. And organization, when I say organization, I mean organization, with actual organization there, like firms, like the political and legal structure, and the cultural domain, shaping values, norms, customs. In the manual that I invite you to read, we go through most of these building blocks, starting from technology. I mean, if technology is not the magic bullet, but for sure in the long term is a sort of necessary condition. You would not have the dynamic that we observe without innovation, both in products and in the process of production. In the manual, one asks a basic question: what is technology? And we try to tackle it in terms of technology as problem-solving procedures, technology as recipes, technology in organization as routines, technology most often as a result as artifacts. Now, think about it. Does it have to do with the way we represent technology in our theory? Absolutely not. I mean, the example that I use with my student is the following. I mean, making a cake, very easy, very simple. I mean, go to your grandmother and say, grandmother, how can I make a cake? And your grandmother tells you, vector, sugar, flour, butter, egg, equal cake. You're not if you did not know before, you don't know now how to make the cake. Suppose also that your grandmother studied a bit of mathematics when she was young and tells you, but you can combine them according to an homogeneous function of degree 1. In that case, you call the ambulance. Say, grandmother, great. But this is exactly what happens in our discipline. You assume that you can combine labor, capital, etc., in a homogeneous function of degree 1. So you can, given the relative prices, you can have produce a steel with very little iron oxide, very little energy, and a lot of labor. You can get a lot of steel that you put your energy, very little, you just use very little mineral, and you get tons of, provided you get a lot of labor inside. You realize it is crazy. I mean, it's like saying that you can make a cake with, depending on the relative prices, with 99% of eggs, which is called an omelette, but it's not a cake. And 99% of butter is something disgusting and nothing else. The same in technology, even more so. And then comes the answer, but what is there a structure in technological knowledge? And this is what we try to identify. I mean, I suggested the notion of technological paradigms, yielding technological trajectory that are the basic structure of technological knowledge characterized by some discontinuities that have to do with changing in paradigm. Now, you can also define different dimensions of knowledge and paradigms in terms of opportunities of innovating and their sources, the tacitness of the knowledge bases on which you draw, the cumulativeness of your advances, the degree and modes of appropriability of economic benefit from innovation. And this distinguishes different paradigms and different modes also of accessing innovation. I mean, only idiots in Brussels can tell the objective is 2% R&D in the European industry. I mean, it means that they've never seen a firm. They've never seen a technology, because in shoemaking, you will never do any R&D. In pharmaceutical, you will have to do 25% R&D if you want to do something. To say the objective is 2%, as if the economy was all, technology did not exist, is only economists can think something else. Now, and I'm getting to the end, not of the manual, but of the presentation. In modern economies, a good deal of the immediate technological activities, I mean, the deep driver are in scientific advances and more fundamental knowledge, but the relatively immediate activities of technological change and transformation of the knowledge in artifact and process of production are nested in firms. Now, what are the firms, and what do firms do? Now, in order to answer to that question, you've got to get rid of any assumption on rationality of the agent, because the world that we were describing is characterized by deep substantive and procedural uncertainty. Substantive in the sense that you don't know events that are simply not there, and procedural in the sense that you don't know how to cope with a certain problem before having coped with that. During the Manhattan Project, the Soviet, where the most interesting thing for them was, are the Americans succeeding in making the bomb? Not how. Because the if was, did they develop is it possible a procedure to control the fission? Most of the uncertainty associated with technology is procedural. I mean, if I tell you you're going to get rich if you make a Ferrari that costs like a Fiat, this is certainly true. The problem is, can you make it? And this has nothing to do with incentives. It's got to do with the fundamental procedural uncertainty that again relate to the knowledge that we were talking about before. In a nutshell, in words that are complex and evolving, it is impossible and even foolish to try to be rational. Because trying to be rational, it means, I mean, if you are anointed by God is another matter, but here we are talking about economics and not by theology. If you really know the world, if you are omniscient, is a different matter. but generally you learn from the past. And even the people trying to argue for rational expectation, they argue that at the end, one way or another, you have got to learn rational expectation. And learning rational expectation one way or another means using the past information. But using the past information might be deeply misleading in evolutionary changing world. We have, and this relates to the second part of the discussion, we have a nice paper with Andrea Raventini and Joe Stiglitz, in which we have an agent base of the kind we shall talk in the second part. And it's agents and agent-based models are characterized by very simple rules. But of course, comes our colleagues and say, agent cannot be idiotic like that. They're much more sophisticated. So we have in our IBM, these are stupid agents, and we want to make as stupid as possible. They decide how much to produce on the ground of the zero parameter statistics that is the most idiotic. Tomorrow is like today. And they make the decision of production on this very, very simple. There is no simpler rule. And then we populate the environment, competing with our idiotic people, also more sophisticated people that know econometrics and use OLS on their own history and the history of the system to decide how much to produce tomorrow. What is the outcome? That the more intelligent agent make less money, they've got a higher probability of dying, and if there are too many, they fuck up the entire system. Why? Because I mean they're violating Heraclitus' principle that you cannot bathe twice in the same river, and they assume that the river is always the same, and they're misled, and in a sense they're masochistic doing that. This applies to individual and even more so to organization. Even this premise, one has got to try to understand what our organization, what they do. And on this point, I'm going to finish. For example, in the language outside macroeconomics, you make statements like firm A is better than firm B in doing X. Macroeconomics, you don't do that because you have got only one firm one agent doing something. What we suggest is that organizational problem-solving entities that are different in terms of hierarchical structure, different distribution of knowledge and power, that is in general different capabilities. Underlying these different capabilities, there are different routines, heuristics, strategies. Note that strategies should not be understood in the game theoretic sense. If you take it in a game theoretic sense, in fact, you don't have competition. I mean, you might have had competition yesterday, but today you don't have it. Because everyone knows what everyone knows what everyone knows. Strategies in business, as well as in war strategies, are conjectural sequences of routines and heuristics that might work. and or might not. And in fact, you go to work schools or maybe business schools. I'm not sure that you learn anything, but maybe business schools to learn precisely these sort of meta heuristics that are the strategies. This view, in my is more than I need. Is able to account straightforwardly for heterogeneous performances of firms in terms of productivity, profitability, growth, survival. Remember that you have enormously wide distribution of labor productivity in industries that are very boring. I mean, Syverson evidence on the US steel coil industry. I mean, there is nothing more boring than steel coil. Still, you have a ratio top to bottom in labor productivity of 4:1 in the United States, not in India. Because these are different capabilities. And they're sticky. They're sticky so that it's very difficult to imitate. Because it's not, the name of the game is complementarity. So it's not enough to imitate or change one element, but you need to change the overall combinatorics. And in fact, a lot of studies in good studies to which person I've contributed with Luigi Marengo and others, how firm learn. Firm learn changing the combination of the routines. And this approach is able to account for the vertical boundaries of the firm and the horizontal boundaries. In that sense, the vertical boundaries are, in a sense, an alternative to the transaction cost explanation of Williamson. And the horizontal boundaries, transaction costs don't explain them at all. And portfolio risk minimization, portfolio-based theory don't account for the observed reality, in the sense that if firms diversified to minimize risk, they would have to choose the most uncorrelated activities. In fact, they diversify in activities that are highly correlated, but they are all affected by the same bundle of capabilities. This is a word, in a synthesis, this is a word of extreme and persistent heterogeneity, in which you have got relatively sticky behavior routines, heuristics, in which firms interact with each other in a competitive process that does not weed out the diversity. It does a little bit, but what drives the system is essentially the within firm learning. And you can do it statistically also. If you try to separate in the dynamics of labor productivity of an industry, you separate the part that is due to within firm dynamic from selection, those that economists, not economics, on the between effect. that is the better firm grow more. What you observe everywhere is that the first dominate the second. Learning is more important than selection. This in the manual we do other things. I do other things. I mean, we consider consumption. Why? I don't think consumption is important, but you need to consider consumption because in every decent textbook there is consumption, and so we discuss consumption and the fact that consumption are nested into cognitive frames, mechanism of social identification, and again have very little to do with demand and supply. We consider how markets work. It is curious that every other word pronounced by an economist is market, but they don't know how markets work. And the reason is, I mean, it's simple, because market was working yesterday, but now we are in equilibrium, and so there is no working of the market. There is never a market actually working, because it was always yesterday. Alan Kerman and myself try to say, well, suppose that we look at the market today, and we try to taxonomize and to understand the dynamics of markets made again of heterogeneous agents. There, one of the conclusions is that at individual level there are no well-behaved demand curves, even in things like fish market during one single day, given the amount of fish. And if anything, there is, under certain condition, the well-behaved demand curve is a result of aggregation. And of course, there is a beautiful theorem by Hildebrandt on the condition in the macro under which you have downward sloping demand curves that have got to do with complicated conditions, have got to do with the covariances of the baskets across income cohorts. Finally, in the book, I study industrial dynamics. Now, all these elements, I think, are the micro foundations for the discussion that we are having in the second round. I mean, these are the building blocks of macroeconomics. This is the fundamental suggestion to you. And then I talk too much and I leave the floor to my friend.
So let me, and I'll be, don't worry, I'll be very brief. Zero sum games and all that. I want to talk one bit about Giovanni's book. I got a copy of it 2 weeks ago. 750 pages. It's a manual, and it's just volume 1. So there's another 750 pages to come.
I hope less.
But and I want to really ask what how did it sort of affect the way I think about some of the problems, some of the sort of fundamental problems of the UK economy. So I'm talking a little bit sort of away from the theme of heterogeneous models, modeling, but I'm just finishing a long book with Wendy Carlin, where we have a large chunk on heterogeneous modelling. I'm actually quite keen to get slightly a little bit of break from it, but I'm really looking forward to your next bit. I found this book a totally fascinating book to read. I mean, I've obviously read over the quite a lot of the literature on evolutionary economics. Obviously, Nelson and Winter, and some of Giovanni's key contributions. But I've never really sort of got down to looking at this whole huge, as it turns out, area of work as a whole. And reading the book really gave me an opportunity to look at all at least the micro side of that. And it's first of all made me fully understand for the first time what a coherent set of micro foundations it provides, at least for people interested as I am very much in the whole question of how technologies change and so on. So anyway, I super recommend reading it. I haven't got shares in him, by the way. And I should say, so Giovanni, in the middle of his talk, says what happens, you know, if you make a dish which is simply a pound of butter, and he says disgusting. Henry James wrote a marvelous book on travels in France, and he gets to Bourg-en-Bresse, which is particularly famous for its cattle and everything else. And he goes into the hotel there, and he says, "I sat down and I at once ordered a pound of butter." And he then describes the enormous pleasure he gets from eating it. I mean, so I don't think we'll talk about this being disgusting, even though I have to say it wouldn't be something which I'd do myself. What's really behind why I'm so taken with the book and with this whole approach, and just to sort of very loosely summarize the two components of this whole approach, which really come out from the book, at least from what I was what I was reading, was first of all the centrality which corporations have. So the corporations, the idea that the corporation is sort of pretty much the key actor in some sense in the way in which one should look at the economy, both from a shorter term and a longer term point of view. The corporation is this organization with capabilities which are embodied in shared routines, shared knowledge of routines and practices, most of it tacit knowledge, which people have. So the people who work in the company know all these, or know their part in a whole range of shared routines. And this focus on companies as organizations with many employees, different profiles, etc., to understand about technological development and so on, is I found much clearer way of thinking about companies that in terms of, let's say, go back to an old idea that the company is simply a set of contracts among the employees and with the owners. And in this way, so employees don't behave as individually rational actors in some sense outside the company, but as taking part in these shared procedures or way of behaving in response to different situations. Now, individual employees, I mean, I'm sort of thinking about university departments, let's say, as the corporation actually, see one that we are pretty much required to think of them as profit-making centres and so on. We're involved, however career-oriented and individualistic we may be, we're actually involved, as we very quickly learn, in taking part in a whole series of shared procedures. I mean, so for example, understanding all about the ref would be an example of that. We're all making use of these shared procedures. We all want to do our best via these shared procedures. But if I simply went in and sat down and, I don't know, what would I do? Try and write an article or something like that, without that context of what I'm doing, what the other things I'm being required to do, how I interact with my colleagues, with my department chair and so on, would make very little sense. So I very much like this way of thinking about things. And these procedures really constitute the capabilities of the corporations, enabling the corporation to react to external shocks and opportunities. Now, the key thing which comes out of this for me is managers are critical to this. So I hope my colleagues aren't listening to this, because I guess a lot of our time is spent complaining about the stupidity and the simple-mindedness of our managers who look and see what we're doing. But if one takes this to corporations, it becomes very clear what a central role managers play in this whole process. How long have I got? 5 minutes. Okay, sure, that's fine. What the central role managers play in this whole process. They're the people who, they can see what these procedures are. They may try and shift them, but to shift a procedure isn't something which they can just decide to do. I mean, they may, but usually chaos if they do. They have to be very carefully pushing things gently, working out what's going to happen, and so on. So you've got this corporation which is pretty tied down actually in all sorts of ways by these capabilities or procedures which it's had, and those capabilities may be really useful capabilities for reacting to market changes or whatever, and to changes in opportunities and so on. Now then comes this other side to this whole, it's very sort of big analysis. It's inspiring. Is technology paradigms. Technology paradigms change very slowly over time. So you have the technology paradigm of England in the 19th century doing all the things it was doing then, or you have the technology paradigm now, let's say, of this various stages we're going through of digitalization. And a technology paradigm nearly always requires a very major change in the way in which the company is organized. So this is a highly disruptive process for companies, because companies find it very difficult to change these paradigms. Hence Schumpeter's phrase, because in Schumpeter, this relates, all your stuff relates very much to Schumpeter. Schumpeter sees this as creative destruction, and it is, and it's very frequently the creation comes because the company literally gets destroyed. The existing companies get destroyed in the process of change. So as it were, if you look at America in the if you look at American, if you look at the top 20 companies in America now, and comparing the top 20 companies 30 years ago in America, they're almost all different. And maybe, well, I think IBM still somehow survives that. So this is a process where this notion of the company being this set of pretty sort of embedded procedures which people all understand and relate to makes a massive sense in why, when you do have a real technological paradigm change, companies simply get, a lot of them just get destroyed. It's quite extraordinary how all those grand Chandlerian companies in the United States in the 50s, 60s, 70s simply got knocked out. So I find that a really useful way of thinking about things. So the role then of managers becomes critical in two different ways. One, how new companies arise, and secondly, how companies develop the procedures they need to operate in the technology paradigm in question. And if one then also, I think Angus said, so could I say something relevant for policymakers today? The really interesting question for me comes looking at managers. And when I was thinking about the question, why has British performance been so bad? Not absolutely in general, but since say the late 2000s, it is very tempting to say that it's British weakness in management, which, if there was one single thing, that seems to be it. So we've had all the Nick Bloom and John Van Reenen studies going back through this period, which started off by showing rather, I mean, it was very dramatic when I first read that article that you had US was top, and then you got Sweden and Germany, and then you got Japan and Canada, and then way down you got the UK and Italy. Not to sort of disparage Italy in any sort of way. What?
You should.
I should. And if you then go through all the changes which have taken place over that was in 2010, that article, the ONS now has a really interesting management study, does this management survey every year, a huge survey. It started in 2016, gone on to the present, and which really confirms a lot of this stuff is doing a little bit better. The studies by Chris Sciolo, who is Sciolo, sorry, I'll get you right. Now the studies which she has pushed through from the OECD are some of the most, I think, most interesting and important studies I've read, which have been used by so many people who they distinguish between frontier companies, frontier corporations, and other corporations. So Julie Baguillon uses it in his latest book. A lot of people do. And what is absolutely staggering is the poor performance of the UK in this, that the UK has by a long way the biggest difference between the average of the frontier companies and the median of the rest of the companies. She then goes on and very recently participated in a big sort of cross-country study of the skills which are used, so they can match up individuals' skills and so on, and companies, and on a very, very wide basis. And what she shows in that is the real importance, the very big role. It's the biggest factor which explains the difference between the productivity level of the frontier companies and the productivity level of the productivity level of the median of the other companies. And she says it's management, which is the biggest factor. That accounts for 30% of the productivity difference, and that's averaged across countries. She doesn't actually do individual country calculations, but it seems extremely likely, given the role of management in the weak mode management in this country, that would account for a lot more of the difference between on her measure between frontier companies in this country and the rest. In addition to that, a lot of the frontier companies in this country are actually American multinationals. And American multinationals, of course, as we know from observant followers of Bloom and Van Reen, they do very well. You know, they've got very good management in this country as elsewhere. So what I found really interesting when I was reading this book was saying, I really think I understand why management plays such an important role, and then it raises this fascinating question: why are British managers so bad? Now, part of it is that a lot of them are men, and as we can see actually as the gender share increases, these soft skills play very key importance in these management skills. Are playing a much bigger role. But it's a very fascinating thing that now we have a very high proportion of people now who go through higher education, and that's clearly higher education is clearly an important factor on how good management is. But our higher education doesn't have the same effect apparently as higher education in America. And part of this, I should stop, shouldn't I? Sorry, yeah, I'll stop. Can you have a think about what you think? Why you think higher education in this country?
Oh, just complete.
Okay, so there now have been serious studies of this, and the key difference is that top management management in the States is really about how well you can run a cooperative group of highly intelligent people. That's, as it were, what's required at the moment. And if you look at how do you have a sort of broad knowledge of sort of everything, etc., etc. So if you go to American universities, go to Harvard, the first 2 years are generally years when you do a whole range of different courses. You're meant to cover the spectrum. Actually, very interesting. Scotland does well on the management score because they have a system where you do a lot of different subjects before you specialize. Secondly, if you think about Oxford, or let's say, it's a highly competitive system. So people are really competing all the time to do better than their peers. At least that was my general experience, spending rather a long time with these kids trying to meet at them to answer nice questions. The American system, as it turns out, is a much broader based system than that. Even in Harvard, you want to do well, you want to get good grade point average and so on. And then part of the further thing is that in the American system, a very large proportion of people go to professional school after that. And we don't really have, I mean, not to diminish the role of business schools here, we don't have a really top level, there's some top levels, we don't have a whole range of top level educational professional schools there. And professional schools increasingly work in this sort of way of learning how to do things. Well, that's so, okay.
Thank you. Now we are going to open the floor for discussion, reflections, questions, and any comments, both online, but also in the room as well.
Thank you. Can I start off? Giovanni, you began by saying that general equilibrium is wholly unsatisfactory for thinking about innovation because you can't have contingent markets and things that haven't been invented yet. But then I'd like to bring that back to agent-based modeling. And how can you use agent-based modeling when things that you want to model also haven't been invented? So how does that get you any progress? Having accepted the criticism of GE, where does agent-based modeling lead to an improvement in the situation?
There is a reply now? Or shall we collect?
Thanks. Maybe I'll just make one question out of the many that I have. But basically, I mean, your claim seems to be, to me, or one of your claims rather, you know, what we've got in terms of mathematics to describe the individual agent problem just is not cutting it, right? So is not doing a good job. That's one of the core claims as I understand it. So if you want to predict what a firm's going to do, if you just, you know, say that there's X workers, Y capital, and the objective is to maximize profits, then you're not going to be able to produce individual behavior. So they might predict individual behavior. So then my question is, like, what are the key ingredients in what? So you've described a lot of stuff, but what are the key ingredients, and how well do you do in predicting individual behavior? And I ask this because we work at the PRA, and our markets are usually six banks. So this, you know, so there's a very limited number of banks that are very large in the market, and they make all the decisions. So if there's like a major improvement in our ability to predict what they're going to do in response to our policies, that would be great. So yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Well, the problem with the zero equilibrium and incompatibility of innovation is that you require in a general equilibrium to predict innovation. More modestly, in an agent-based model, you generate innovation. I mean, there are agents that, by applying relatively simple behavioral rule, they discover new machines, which involve new techniques of production, or in the most recent generation of our model, new products. It's not that they knew before what they were getting out. So you don't have any problem of prediction ex ante. In fact, I mean, you want agent-based models are able to deal with uncertainty because they are fully incorporated into the model, because you don't ask agents to, in a sense, overcome it, but they live with it. And they try, and sometimes they invest, they search, sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail. Which somewhat related to the question. I mean, there is one issue of prediction, another issue of explanation. I mean, I think that economics tend to fold them too much together. Predicting what the people are doing now, well, the answer is look at that. Look at them and see what they do. I mean, there is a dramatic lack of observation of what agents actually do. I mean, we were talking yesterday night with David. he comes from Oxford. In Oxford, you had a tradition of let's go to firms and ask how they make prices. You don't need to predict how they make prices if you ask them, or maybe you don't ask, but you go and observe them. There is, around 10 years ago, an article that I enjoyed very much by Stark and Bales on industrial corporate change on the back office behavior of investment banks. I think one should do more of these things to identify actual behavioral regularities. And on that ground, then also, well, one can say, given this pattern of behavior, there's been an increase in interest rate, maybe they do this and that, I don't know what, but on the ground of the regularity, the heuristics that we were talking about before. For example, an interesting question is, are these heuristic bank specific, or do they have something in common? I think one should rediscover sort of economic anthropology well done, in a sense. That would allow also then to stylize some regularities that we can put into the agent-based models. And in fact, I mean, for example, when I say markup, and we use markups in our models, the empirical literature that I can cite are from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s a little bit, and that's it. Because when economists realized that there was a conflict between the observation and the theory, instead of dropping the theory, they dropped the observation. And Matchlop precisely prescribes it. If there is a conflict between the theory and the observation, try to discredit the evidence. If you don't succeed, drop it, neglect it. To have more recent evidence on pricing behavior, yes, I've got to confess, I had to do and read marketing science. Marketing science.
I have a question on technology. So you mentioned technology, and I think there are many ways to measure it. I think there are different views as to whether, for example, in the past century, as the technology overall, do you think is maybe more of a paradigm shift, or maybe is there a way to measure improvement? Because I think that there are some views who view that the technology has not improved in the past century, or even.
Okay, say it again. I don't get it.
Okay, so the question is about technology, and the general question is, since basically technology will be an aggregate series, so an aggregate data from the model. So my question is, do you think for the economy, do you think the technology has improved in the past century, or do you think it has not improved? So there are different views as to whether it has improved, right? So my question is on your view as to whether technology has improved or not.
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't like very much aggregate technology. I mean, technology are specific. I mean, our technology are ways of doing things that are particular things. I mean, there is a technology to make cars, maybe more than one. And there is another set of technologies to search and make drugs. if one folds it together, then it's easy to fall into the aggregate production function that is a sort of imaginary monstrous creature. I mean, there are, in the real world, there are many single technologies. These single technologies have certainly improved over the last century, and they continue to do so. If there is a major minus that we economists, but also society at large, never consider, is that a byproduct of these advances often has been environmental destruction. Environmental destruction has never been a dimension considered from Smith and Marx onward. I mean, and that is falling on our head now. So it is as if progress was done at the expense of nature also. Now we should, technically variable, I think, to reorient the trajectory of search, having as a first priority the fact that you should not further destroy the environment. And it's not only CO2. I mean, there is a long list of pollutants that we distribute in the environment. This is something that also evolutionary economics has neglected with a sort of Marx Schumpeter optimism. Of course, when the communist societies have done even worse than capitalism in terms of destroying nature. And here we are here.
Any comments? So we can conclude the first session. So we have a half an hour break, and then we'll be back at 4 for the second session.
There is maybe some question, no? From the audience.
And a link on a Swiss government project that it refers to more than a question, it seems.
It
It seems it's more like a comment, and linking a document here to reference it. But I'm happy to read. So it's from Piano Valentino. Formidable speech by Dosi. His foundations allow for a vast array of policies building on an evolutionary perspective or policy-oriented, amplitude-based, agent-based model for energy transition can be found here. It's the final report of a project for the Swiss government. It's an agreement with Dosi call for a technological trajectory for a better environment. So it was linking to one of your work too.
yeah.
So thanks everyone for your interest, and hope to see you in the second session in half an hour at 4. So we're going to talk more about heterogeneity interactions and macroeconomic modeling with different stands of modeling choices, including ABMs, but others as well. So thanks a lot.
Welcome to the second session. The second session will be focusing on heterogeneity and interaction and some of the macroeconomic implications of that. Now, we're delighted to have Giovanni leading the presentation. And we have 2 discussants who will be joining us online, both from France. Beatrice Cherrier from CNRS, CREST, and École Polytechnique will be the first discussant. Beatrice is probably very well known to people in her social media nom de plume of the undercover historian, I think that's correct, and who has just published a paper, or having a paper published in the European Economic Review, in fact, on heterogeneity. Our second discussant is Muriel Dalpont-Legrand from the University of Côte d'Azur. I hope that pronunciation was all just about acceptable. CNRS and GREDDEG. Now, Professor Legrand is an expert, obviously, in the history of macroeconomics, but in particular has been looking at complexity. And so I think it'd be very valuable to hear her reflections on the history of this subject, but also how it compares and contrasts to other approaches to heterogeneity. So Giovanni's going to speak for 40 minutes, and Giovanni, I'm a little bit tougher on time than others. So I will keep you to time if it kills me. Giovanni's going to speak for 40 minutes, and then Beatrice and Muriel will speak for 10 minutes each, and then we'll have a discussion. So Giovanni, over to you.
Well, this is not only ideal, but effective follow-up of the first part. And to repeat, I think in the first part of this our conversation, we have all the bricks that make up the macro edifice. Let me just recall them in an extremely brief way in terms of methodology, interpretative element, and stylized fact to be explained. Now, I want to emphasize that complexity is a scientific term. It's not equivalent of complicated. Complexity means, I want to cite Herb Simon, roughly by a complex system, I mean one made up of a large number of parts that interact in a non-simple way. In such a system, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. Not in any ultimate metaphysical sense, but in the important pragmatic sense that, given the properties of the parts and the laws of their interaction, is not a trivial matter to infer the property of the whole. And this is exactly the opposite to the reductionist methodology that we find in macroeconomics. You had a trend, but we'll get back to that. Already in the old, say, various version of Keynesian macroeconomics after World War II, but these we went to the extreme in the simplification, in the anti-complexity direction. I was already mentioning emergence, more is different, non-linearity and path dependence, history counts, evolution, new emerging properties, new emerging entities, ubiquitous disequilibrium dynamics. This is another fundamental point. I mean, the economist obsession with equilibrium is one of the major obstacles to the understanding of socioeconomic phenomena. I mean, it is like saying, like having in natural sciences equilibrium biology. Our very existence is a disequilibrium phenomenon. I mean, if you had a thermodynamic equilibrium, we'd all be dead, and there'd be maximum entropy and total disorder. I mean, we exist as disequilibrium phenomenon. All the entities, and in nature, there are good reasons to think of a principle of conservation, so that you need some energy from the outside. Generally, the system, our dissipative system. So you we get energy from one side and we dissipate it. And this disequilibrium produces order, as such. The socio-economic system are anti-dissipative for a fundamental reason. We can create endogenously knowledge and information. So it is as if we created more within ourselves more energy than what we acquire from the outside. That is something that in physical system cannot be there. And so the formalism for in physics would be you are crazy. But it's a formalism that we have got to develop because we can, so to speak, build on ourselves. We are always a symmetry breaker by building on our own knowledge. Now, the interpretative elements, I was mentioning it already, are technical change and innovation as partly endogenous evolutionary processes, substantive and procedural uncertainty, ubiquitous heterogeneity among agents, diversity in market dynamics and pattern of industrial evolution. I would need to add to that the institutional embeddedness of all this. Institutional embeddedness written large, the embeddedness into institution like corporate organization and broader institution like states, government agency, etc. Now, the stylized fact, we have been talking about them already. I want to emphasize that one, you want to have interpretation that are at least in principle consistent with each other of this phenomenon. In particular, about the macro patterns, you would like to give a unified interpretation. I mean, in a sense, for opposite reason, the evolutionary agent-based tradition agrees with Chicago that you cannot separate short-term and long-term. I mean, you remember the old macroeconomics saying the long-term is the trend, is solo. The short-term is Keynes ISLM. Chicago comes along and says, well, what is the short-term, what is the long-term? I mean, why do you want to have an agent that in the long term are neoclassical, but in the short term are myopic, or let's have a unified explanation? We agree. A unified explanation, totally different, but we totally agree that this distinction is very, very much artificial. Now, we want to a macro model has got to account for the foregoing irregularities. If you have a model that satisfies that requirement, as I believe the agent-based models well done begin to do, then you can use this model for as policy laboratory. In the sense that in an agent-based model, you are almost God. You take out almost. You are God. You created the world. And so you can say, in this world, what happens if I increase public expenditure? You don't need to go and estimate you simply say, well, I push this lever, and let's see what happens to the dynamics of GDP. So it's a place where, of course, we have got to trust a lot the model, and trusting the model means that you are able to account robustly for for a lot of stylized facts. This brings also to the idea that is, I think, is misleading in agent-based model of calibration. I don't want calibration. Is a pseudo-scientific device to reconcile the evidence with the SGE models. This is called calibration, and you calibrate, you linearize, you do up this and that. I don't want an agent-based model to be calibrated. I want them to generate the qualitative property of the system for very wide range of parameters. I want to have them in the real crucial variables insensitive to changes in parameterization. When I see an agent-based model and say, I parameterize this with 1.52. What happens with 1.53? I would like to hear it start saying, with any parameterization between 1 and 3, I get the same qualitative result. In the rest of this presentation, I will not talk much about DSG, if not with some remarks. Why? Let me be brutal and cite Bob Solow in 1984, when he was asked by Arjo Klemmer in an interview what he thought about Chicago, the people from Chicago. And I think this applies even more so to DSG. He says, well, suppose someone sits down where you are sitting right now and announces to me, I'm a psychiatrist, announces to me that he is Napoleon Bonaparte. The last thing I want to do with him is to get involved in a technical discussion of cavalry tactics in the Battle of Austerlitz. If I do that, I'm tacitly down in the game that is Napoleon. Now, Bob Lucas and Tom Sargent like nothing better than get down in technical discussion, because then I have tacitly gone along with their fundamental assumption. Your attention is attracted away from the basic witness of the whole story. Since I find that fundamental framework ludicrous, I respond by treating it as ludicrous. That is, by laughing at it, so as not to fall into the trap of taking it seriously and passing on a matter of techniques. This is typically my attitude. Then sometimes, for academic reason, I'm forced to take it seriously. My co-authors often take it more seriously than I do. I think it's a mistake because, I mean, you cannot, if someone tells you that he's Napoleon, you cannot take it serious, take him serious. We'll talk about that. I hope that there'll be some disagreeing views. Now, in a well-done agent-based model, we have got multiple heterogeneous agents, functionally distinct. Firms, worker, consumers, governments. People can have also different functions. It can be workers and then consumer, and behave in quite different ways. often. I mean, you don't need a Unitarian max anything. You have well-specified mechanisms of interaction, a network, preferential attachment, or even more deeply within organization. The majority of, the overwhelming majority of our acts of whatever kind, of all of us, occur in a no-market context. We go to school, we teach, we don't teach, we go to the cinema, we read a book. Herb Simon was using once upon a time the metaphor saying someone comes from Mars and sees all the activities that are marked as red dots, and the activities that are within organization as green dots. What will the Martian see? Well, we see islands and continents of green linked by some red, not a lot of red with some green in between when there are transaction costs. It's exactly the opposite. And an agent-based model have got to take that into account, either explicitly or implicitly. You have relatively simple behavioral rules. We were talking about it before. David was talking about it. Routines, heuristics, and the fundamental imperative is what kind of routine heuristic has got to be empirically disciplined by the observation of what agents actually do. And on that we dramatically lack evidence, because economies stopped doing even that little bit of empirical research. If you ask a PhD student to go and ask firms how they set price, they say I know. They maximize, no? Why should I go and ask? And this is terrible. This is terrible because we don't have any, or relatively little ground to discipline the assumption that we make on the, except those in which that we inherited from research done essentially half a century ago. Finally, I want to emphasize no ex-ante commitment to the consistency among micro decisions. Again, emergence. Now, we have a family of Schumpeter meeting Keynes models that the father is the Dosi et al. General Economic Dynamics and Control 2010, and we have developed a family of models on exploring financial and monetary policy, the impact of labor market flexibility, the role of heuristic, the paper that I was telling you before on with Joe Stiglitz, the effect of unionization or deunionization, or the double role of technical change as labor creator and labor destroyer. And since this is so far from the typical macro discussion, this is exactly what I would like to talk to you about in the rest. But to repeat, and this is the fundamental link with policies, the way I consider the K-process family of models is also a laboratory for policy experiments and comparative institutional settings. So comparing, for example, competitive and Fordist regime of organization of labor relations. You ask, I mean, the vulgata is get the labor market more flexible, you will increase employment and possibly growth. Is that true? We have more than 3 models showing exactly the opposite. That by flexibilizing the labor market, in fact, you reduce the demand generation capability of wages. And so you tend to introduce a deflationary bias in the system. You can experiment on different systems of innovation. I forgot to add, you can experiment with different environmental policies. Science and technology policy, monetary policy, fiscal, trade. I'm doing a bit of marketing, but I think that this family of models is a promising toolbox for macroeconomics. I mean, the 3 fundamental elements, as I see them in at least the K-process, meaning Schumpeter-Meeting case, family of models. You have got an endogenous growth process driven by innovation and diffusion. We call it the Schumpeterian engine. An aggregate demand process driven by investment and worker consumption. Call it the Keynesian engine. And we have a labor market and labor relation mechanism of wage formation, etc., operating under different type of regulation regimes. And it's the combination between these 3 that essentially drives the dynamics of the system. Now, I was saying I will refer in the following to them, in a sense, the most distant from macroeconomics to show also the flexibility of this art form. Now, it is a discussion since Ricardo's time. What is the effect of technical change? Is it labor displacing, non-labor displacing? Do you have compensation effect in the sense that essentially supply creates its own demand? This is the labor market side of Seth's law. In this paper, we study the compensation or lack of compensation in a 2-sector model that at the same time generate labor-saving innovation, but generate also new products. After all, technical progress is about making more efficient the production of what you already make or producing new products. Remembering, easy but not so easy for economists, that product innovation in the machine making sector, in the equipment making sector, is often process innovation for the downstream sector adopting them. Of course, you cannot see this in 1-sector models. You need 2 sectors at least. Now, The basic structure is that you've got on the one side a different institutional regime of the labor market. You've got endogenous arrival of new paradigmatic technology, the endogenous emergence of and collapse of industry, and that co-evolves with the evolution of consumption, of the pattern of consumption, which are important as a mechanism of demand generation. Now, I don't have much time, and I will just introduce the basic structure of the two-sector model without entering into many details. You have workers, two sectors, many firms in each of the sector. You have got bank financing firms if needed, workers that send, so to speak, job application to the firms. You've got a government that levy taxes on profits and pay an employment benefit. Incidentally, it is an interesting experiment if you turn that completely off. If you turn the stabilizer, the Keynesian stabilizer of the government, you turn it completely off. The paper 2010. This makes the system basically collapse because you don't need much stabilization, but you need some. Otherwise, if you leave only the Schumpeterian leg of the system without the ability of the system of generating enough demand, irrespectively of those endogenously generated by the investment by capitalists, you have got a very, very high frequency of crisis, independently of how much Schumpeterian cocaine you give to the system. It does not take off. And so also the long-term rate of growth is low, much lower. You have a timeline of events that I will not go through. But it is important to think that there is a timeline of events. You don't have simultaneity. This is another parenthesis, yet another philosophical parenthesis. Simultaneity is already an implicit, very heavy commitment to equilibrium. Things happen in sequence. Then the frontier would be to have sequences that are asynchronous across agents. This is also, from the point of view of the programming, a frontier because it's difficult. But already to have a sequence within periods is a major advance. I mean, it is, if you think of it technically, there is the same difference that there is between a differential equation, a system of differential equation, and a system of difference equation. And often they have very little to do with each other. Anyway, innovation occurs through a two-step stochastic process in which first you draw a Bernoulli, whose value depends on the money you put in. And you pay this lottery Yes, so I innovate or I don't innovate. If you say yes, I innovate, then you make the actual draw. That can be that you make successful innovation or unsuccessful one. It's like getting the ticket to fish in a pond. You got the ticket, and then you go to fish. Sometimes you get a fish, some other times you get a shoe. And the parameterization, of course, of this distribution between shoe and fish capture both the technological opportunities available in the system and your own ability to fish, the capabilities we were talking about before. The same with imitation. It's a two-step process. You innovate concerning two dimensions. The productivity in producing a machine and the productivity of the machine. The downstream sector, the one that produces the consumption good, buys, when they buy a machine of a certain family, of a certain vintage, this is associated with the productivity that is what is written on the brochure of the machine times the skill of the workers that you put on the machine. Will they down the consumption goods sector buy machines? Well, they buy it for two reasons. One, if they need to expand, and they need to expand if they expect to have a higher demand tomorrow than today, roughly speaking. In a very adaptive way, I was telling before the story of the more sophisticated way to calculate demand. This is one of the two reasons. The other reason is that you want to scrap all the investment. How you do scrap them? Basically, use the rule that firms tend to use, that is a payback period. For how long will I need to repay back the cost of the machine in terms of cost saving associated with the more productive machine? You have a process of entry. Competition in the final market works according to a sort of replicator dynamics. Why we call it quasi-replicator? Because the replicator dynamics technically lives on a unit simplex. This does not live on the unit simplex, so you can get market share that are higher than the sum of the market share that is higher than one, or market share that are negative. So you readjust the firms that have got a market share below zero, you declare them dead, and you recalculate the market share. So it's a quasi-replicator dynamics that also determines death of the firm. You have a mechanism of the labor market by which unemployed workers send, metaphorically, their brochure to a firm or queue in front of a firm, metaphorically. And you have got two mechanisms of wage fixation. One, call it Fordist, in which all workers, in effect, in a firm have the same wage. And this is also determined by macroeconomic condition, I mean, national bargaining, basically. And you have got another competitive mechanism, a competitive regime, in which you have got individual wages and the differentiation of wages also within firms. You have rules for hiring and firing. Time is running out. You've got banks that lend, if needed, to firms when the firms need, when their cash flow is below the amount required also to invest in expansion or replacement. Government, I was already saying it, levy taxes and pay an employment benefit. An interesting experiment there is what happens if you move up and down the unemployment benefit and the profit taxation. The fundamental point is that this model generically generate this long list of stylized facts. And this is bloody impressive. It generates a long list of even very fine micro-stylized facts. You've got a skewed firm size distribution, fat-tailed growth rates of the firm, heterogeneous productivity. Remember that here in these models, we begin with homogeneous firms. The process of differentiation is all endogenous. Persistent productivity differential, lump investment rates of firms, heterogeneous skill distribution, fat-tailed employment time distribution, tenure time and unemployment time. You have got also on the consumption side in the last generation, cross-sectional angle law, heterogeneous propensity to save and consume. Again, remember that at the beginning, all the worker saving is zero. You have got a stepwise increase in the technological frontier and rates of radical innovation, the arrival of new family and new products that obviously is on time scale lower than incremental innovation. And you've got a shape diffusion of dominant technologies. This is a lot. Then you've got an even more impressive series of macroeconomic stylized facts. Endogenous self-sustained growth with persistent fluctuation. Here we don't see it like in real business cycle that you have if the shocks arrive autocorrelated, then also the GDP that comes out is autocorrelated. Here we have got decentralized, completely decentralized search processes. Endogenous, call them shocks, endogenous shocks that are the discovery of new machines by decentralized group of firms. Fat-tailed GDP growth rate distribution. Endogenous volatility of GDP consumption and investment. These are macroeconomically cross-correlated. Pro-cyclical R&D investment, persistent and counter-cyclical unemployment, unemployment and inequality are correlated, and you have got more or less, but more or less as much as in reality, beverage curves In beverage curve, you might remember Bob's solo remark showing the beverage curve and saying, if in these points you see a beverage curve, you can see anything. They are very, very, very abstract painting. Ocon curves, wage curves that are quite robust. Matching function. And in the multi-product setting, you've got also product life cycle, exponential age distribution of products, and you've got a beginning of a structural change emerging out of our simulation. I don't have time to show you any of that, but I summarized it before. In the model that does all that, as we said, is also able to account the condition under which you have roughly compensation effect between the two effect of technical change of labor creation and labor destruction. And essentially, to put it in a nutshell, this is associated qualitatively with the post-World War 30 years glorious decades in which you had, say, a social democratic regime, whatever in the different countries called, of regulation of the relationship between productivity and wages, with the two indexed, with wages indexed on productivity, a lot of process innovation, fast diffusion of complex consumer goods, automobiles, fridges, TVs, etc. So the productivity was growth was compensated by high demand growth. I mean, Schumpeterian and Keynesian engine were working well together. Most of these conditions disappeared since the 80s. And you can naturally account for these things as emergent properties in the model. I've finished the operation of marketing. I think that is very promising indeed.
Thank you, Giovanni. We'll pick up on some of those outputs that this form of heterogeneity is capable of. Can I pass setting the microphone, hopefully the screen, to Beatrice? I think you're going to be loading and driving your own slides.
Beatrice had some instability, I think, in the wireless system, and she was kicked out of Teams. So I hope she can come back.
That's Muriel. Okay. Well, Muriel, are you ready to start your discussion?
Yeah, I can start.
Well, why don't we change the order? And oh, hang on.
So she's I'm back, but her microphone is not allowed. If we can get the technical.
So we'll yeah, Muriel, perhaps if you could start, then we'll sort out. Oh, here's Beatrice.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So Muriel may share the screen in case I have trouble again. We have a joint presentation, in fact.
Yes.
So Muriel, maybe you can just, I'll tell you when to get the slide running. So if I leave, she can actually proceed with the presentation.
Okay, the only point is that I cannot find the presentation. I do not know why. Can you see the presentation?
Not a presentation yet. We can see Teams.
Yeah. Not a good thing, not Teams, sorry. I tried to have the presentation, but it does not work.
Okay, so I think we can share the slide on our side. So
Okay.
just a sec. Yes, so we'll.
Je ne comprends pas pourquoi tu n'y arrives pas.
All right. Can you share?
I think we can. Just one moment.
Okay. So much pressure on the right hand right now.
All right. Oh, wow.
Okay, me, I can hear you, but I cannot share the presentation. I do not know why.
Okay, I think we can share it for you. So if
Okay,
you stop,
thank you.
then we'll do this.
Okay, perhaps it would be good. I see Beatrice is there, so perhaps
Yes.
Beatrice can start.
Okay.
And
So
then I
I'm
continue just in case.
I'm going to try to, please interrupt me if that's too bad. Muriel will just do without me.
Okay,
Do you hear me well right now?
We do, and we have the presentation up. If you just say when you need the slide changed.
Okay, so what we're going to do here is basically resituate Giovanni's textbook in a wider conversation on heterogeneity in macroeconomics. Muriel, can you shift the slide? So to do so, we're going to present a different type of history. So the usual history is basically that, you know, macroeconomics is mostly DSG, and DSG is mostly representative agents. And so whatever is being done differently goes against DSG. That's what you have here. It's a kind of sort of DSG versus agent-based model story. Can you shift this slide? So basically, historians tend to have a different perspective. Here, for instance, you have a picture of what just mainstream macroeconomics in the US in the middle 2000s was. These are the all the working groups that are at the NBR under the program led by Bob Hall, the fluctuation cycle program. And as you can see, there are only you have the impulse and propagation mechanism that was full DSG, but most of the others, people interested in this topic did not write DSG models. So there were different communities doing different types of modeling. And so what we're going to try to do is to restart from that premise. Can we have the next slide? And so our premise is basically, okay, what we have in macroeconomics in the last 50 years is that everyone was dissatisfied with representative agent. Everyone knew it was better to have more heterogeneity in macroeconomics. And what we have is different communities trying to deal with heterogeneity very differently. So what we do in that presentation is that we've picked up selective communities that are of interest here. And of course, one of them is Giovanni's, like Schumpeter-McCain's type of agent-based modeling. And so we just give sketchy pictures of who are these communities and what they were willing to give away and to keep to actually have macroeconomic models with more heterogeneity. And what is interesting here is that these various communities didn't have the same modeling strategies and the same commitments. Some were willing to let go general equilibriums, others didn't. Some have like very optimizing kind of microfundation, others have other types of microfundation. Some were focused on equilibriums and other not. Sorry. And so this is what we're sorry, the people are not happy with me standing in the hole, so I need to move. Can you hear me?
You were just breaking up a bit there while
Can you still
moving.
hear me?
Yes, don't move.
No, I cannot hear it. Okay, can we? Yeah, sorry. Okay. Are you still there?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, can we change the slides? So I'm going to try to talk very quickly about like 3 communities. The first one, as the one associated, was representative agents. So as you can see here, even those economists who actually wrote for representation like England at Minnesota, they knew that there were problems. They
Beatrice, we can't hear you anymore. If you can hear us. Yeah, I think we've. Muriel, are you there?
Yes, I'm there.
Many problems for instance, the labor.
Béatrice.
Okay.
Béatrice, on t'entend plus.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I'm constantly shifting from spots to spots. Okay, I'm going to do a last attempt as trying to talk. And if it's not working, you just keep going. So did you hear me on that first community? So even the people doing a representative agent macro, they actually knew that there were a problem that could be fixed if they could bring more heterogeneity. For instance, they could sort of match the wealth distribution better, match the equity premium better, and so forth. So Prescott did not do that, but many students at Minnesota actually wrote models with some kind of heterogeneity, both in households and firms. And can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they did it in a very specific way because they actually wanted to preserve the general equilibrium setting, also some optimizing microfoundation. So all they had basically is to write model with what is called stochastic heterogeneity, in which people basically are just all the same ex ante, but they face different types of shocks, and though they differ ex post. Okay, so that was one very specific type of heterogeneity, and after doing that for 10 years, basically.
Muriel, I think we'll have to call on you. It's quite
Okay.
Here.
But now she's back.
Sorry.
Je pense
okay,
que tu devrais couper ta caméra.
Yes. Can we have the next slides? Okay. So as I said, Minnesota people just wanted general equilibrium models with microfoundation and whatever heterogeneity could fit into that, and this wasn't much. Other people were willing to let go.
Muriel?
Yeah.
I think it'd be best if you take over here because that's probably.
Yeah, I understand.
We're
if you want, perhaps we give a chance to Beatrice to complete after we've questioned our presentation, and perhaps you go to the next slide with the common feature. So not the third community, but the next again. The next one. Yeah. So in the division of labor, the idea was that I continue to do that work, situating the work of Giovanni Dosi, but focusing this time on macroagent-based models to see to what is exactly not exactly your contribution, I would need more time for that, but to characterize your approach. So to first, let's characterize quickly what is a macro-adjoint-based model, because finally you explained very well adjoint-based model in the first presentation, but when we went to macro, you were more quick perhaps, and I don't know what people know about that. So the idea clearly, perhaps better to insist on that, is that one of the areas inside of economics is that aggregate patterns are formed from individual behaviors, and those individual behaviors in turn respond to those aggregate patterns. So if you believe in that macro-adjoint based is maybe useful, is that you believe there is a recursive loop between these two levels. And so that loop is at the origin of the complexity in economics. So gradually, building on adjoint-based model, the question became expressed this way: how individual behavior might react to the pattern they together create, and how that pattern could alter itself as a result. So how a process of that nature is created from the purposed action of multiple agents, and the point how the heterogeneity of this agent can affect the loop and the result of the loop. So in general, macro-adjoint-based modeler consider that it should be the real purpose of macroeconomics to consider the economy as a complex evolving system. Asking how agent would react to aggregate patterns, okay, but this means that we are implicitly assuming that non-equilibrium situation can emerge. Then those people build an economy populated by heterogeneous agents whose far from equilibrium interaction continuously change the structure of the system. So now how this is possible, okay? Of course, adjoint-based model represent opportunities for modelers who want to depart from traditional hypotheses, whatever they are, on rationality, on many other things, okay? But the single most important feature, the really fundamental one, which really characterizes adjoint-based model, is the autonomy of the elements. So the absence of centralized, top-down coordinating or controlling mechanism. Then in that context, if you have, and I go at the beginning of this slide, if you have decentralized systems, then you need to coordinate people. So local social interaction becomes of fundamental importance. And in that case, if you have social interaction, of course, heterogeneity of agents matters and matters a lot. So the point is not so much to have heterogeneity or not compared to more traditional approach, is the fact that you have a decentralized system and that this will give a specific role to heterogeneity, and the distribution of that heterogeneity will be of fundamental importance. Then, of course, you have a bottom-up macroeconomic approach, and emergence phenomena are possible. So clearly, as soon as you have decentralization and that heterogeneity matter, you have room for coordination and disequilibrium. They are really at the core of this sort of approach. So coordination can endogenously increase or decrease over time. It really depends on the context, the nature of the available information. So the real point is that it's not that there is no coordination, is that you cannot guarantee that whatever the context, the level of activity, okay, your coordination mechanism still works. And then this depends on the topology and the dynamics of the network. So this is the fundamental starting point, and I think we can agree that macro-adjoint-based model all share this sort of hypothesis with more or less heterogeneity, but in general, they include heterogeneity. And you can have, of course, period of no coordination or disequilibrium. Then can we go to the next slide? So nevertheless, we can put everything. Nevertheless, thank you very much. It is not because we have this common feature that people working on macro-adjoint-based modeling are an homogeneous community. You have a large variety of groups. I took the list of the group in DAWID and Delegati, but I also analyzed them, and we try to characterize communities also doing bibliometrics, and this confirms more or less these groups. And we have no time here to speak about all of them, because some of them are also quite different in their target and their methodological approach. But nevertheless, of course, the first two ones are quite close. They are quite close in the way they address the issue, in the way they model, and nevertheless, they are also different. And it is why we try to address now is to see to what extent agent-based models are a tool, only a tool, or really drive with themselves more epistemologic variety, let's say variety of status, and can shape different communities despite apparent similarities. So perhaps we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Yeah, so we focus on the first two one. So the first one, the fifth community, the Italian ABN. As you will see, in Italian. So I know Giovanni knows about that. He wrote a paper on that, but let's focus on that first community. So it is Dosi and his co-author, so a big barycentre in Pisa, even if not all the co-authors are in Pisa. And why they try to integrate, to use agent-based model and to introduce heterogeneity, their really purpose, fundamental purpose, is modeling capital accumulation, embodied technical progress, and skill dynamics. So they want to analyze how all this generate growth, fluctuation, and inequality dynamics. So clearly the starting point, and I think the first presentation was very clear on that today, is modeling industrial dynamics. And then to analyze the interaction between innovation and Schumpeterian's idea and demand dynamics of Keynes. The implication is that it's not really, you will understand why I say that comparing with the other community, it's not really a program of research focused on a specific issue they want to explain. They focus on general characteristics they think are of fundamental importance, innovation, the diffusion of innovation, the articulation with demand, and so on. And they want to have a very general model. Concerning empirical validation, they are a great capacity to reproduce observed fluctuation. In that case, they are already challenging the SG on their own turf. But sometimes models are complex, and perhaps we can discuss with Giovanni, but the real challenge is to really be able to trace the shocks. But the SGE models have this sort of problems too, when sometimes a combination of different parameters leads to the same fluctuation, for instance. So the models are really tailored after for specific economic policy purpose, which has been examined by many people. Rovantini also has produced papers on that. And really, they defend the idea that they are very well suited for evaluating economic policy, being able to do really on-purpose model depending on different situation. Okay, I have to say that we made some work in bibliometrics, and that work stopped in 2018. So I guess now maybe the work is obsolete because Giovanni has published a lot in the last 3 years. But despite the fact that you were quite prolific, Giovanni, but you were not the most prolific, but your two papers, 2010, the KS model, and 2013, no, sorry, yes, 2010, 2013, the one of income distribution, credit, and fiscal policy, are the most quoted papers by the community of macro agent-based modelers. So clearly, it's a very influential work. Then perhaps we can go to the second slide. There is another Italian community, again, a mix of Ancona and Milano, Delegati Gallegati, the so-called research program, the CATS. You could understand that coming from Minsky, who gave the name of the CATS to the two authors. Their approach is a little bit different. Their purpose is to integrate really finance and production. I think in mind the idea that this way they could better explain fluctuations. And explaining fluctuation is, of course, with the objective to fit observed data, but mainly it's what also Stiglitz developed with them, is the idea that you must be able to explain a model, must be able not only to mimic fluctuation, but to explain why relatively small shocks can create big downturn. So it's really the problem of amplification, and in this case, financial amplification. They even produce some hybrid model in which they introduce, let's say, agent-based model in the credit cycle, in the credit market, and then introduce this in the DSGE to see how we can improve or let's say lead to different results than a pure DSGE model. So their objective is really to modeling financial instability. So it was why I say that the first attempt is larger, it's a more general model than the PISA group wants to produce. And the Ancona, Milano people, they are more focused on financial instability. Then they introduce also heterogeneity. So in the first case with Giovanni, I think it is mainly at the level of the firms and the productivity of the firms. There can be different sources of heterogeneity, but this may be one of the major ones. Here it can be, for instance, on the wealth of the firms and their interconnection, and then in addition, their connection to the central bank or the banks. The banks first and then the central bank. This was very much influenced by the work they did before, but by the book by Greenwald and Stiglitz published in the early 2000s on the new paradigm for monetary economics. Then the macro agent-based model in that case are designed much more in order. Sorry, I was looking for the question. Sorry, I was disturbed. They are designed more explicitly as tools to explore various theoretical situations. Does not mean that they do not look for empirical validation, they do, but they were first conceived as exploratory tools. Then it's not exactly with exactly the same tool, it's not exactly the same epistemological status, and then not exactly the same project. And in this case, they want to trace specific influence. And in general, if they are good doing that, they lose a little bit of the capacity to mimic fluctuation at the macroeconomic level. So a good performance at the market level and some more nuanced capacity to develop model and to mimic fluctuation at the macro level. So perhaps we can go to the next slide. Okay, so I try to be brief, that we have some times for conclusion, discussion, and that perhaps we have a chance to hear the end of the part by Beatrice. Let's say, what we can see finally is that there is a large heterogeneity. I cannot show you too much, but it is clear that first, if you look at the diffusion of agent-based model in economics, what we did not do here, they are relatively easily adopted by other fields, but there is a more difficult problem at the macroeconomic level to adopt them. You can see that the diffusion within the profession is more difficult. Then if you look now at the macro community, there are some heterogeneity. Those two ones, which seems to be the closest one, are different. Does not mean that they cannot cross-fertilize each other, but they are relatively different. And if I could have gone into the 5 other ones, you could have seen a great heterogeneity of models. So this is the first point. The second point is that that variety of model, I would like to know from Giovanni, is the variety of model is for him represent a richness of the approach or a part of his weakness, because we have variety of model in DSGE and so on, but the core hypotheses are quite similar, and then you have variance. But in that case, it's not exactly the point. You have different models insisting on different linkage between the different spheres, the different markets. So to what extent the variety of model is a source of weakness or a source of richness? What does it mean in terms of economic policy conclusion? And then I come to the project of the textbook. The idea is what is really your fundamental goal, I think, doing that book. My point, a textbook is really important. We know as historians of economic thought that studying textbooks, it's a good way to have an idea at the moment of the time of the core knowledge that everybody is using. So it's very important. Textbooks always mean something like that. But does the textbooks ask for objective to convince people outside macro-agent-based models? Or does it has, on the contrary, you can have both objective, of course, but that's it much more emphasize that target internal people, and with the objective to show what are your tools and how people could gain what they could gain using your tools, and then reducing the diversity of approach in macro agent-based model. I may have other questions, but I think it is important that Beatrice has sometimes to intervene also at the end. I don't know if your connection is okay, if you want to comment on the last question.
Yeah, it's just good now. So it was just for my speech, but I'm just going to leave it there. I guess even without having all the community, and especially not the British communities that were also interested, because they are mostly microeconomists who are concerned with theoretical and empirical aggregation, and that are trying to answer macro questions from micro data in which there is rich heterogeneity, but still want to have some sort of optimizing or near optimizing micro foundation. So you get the point. You have a lot of communities all thinking about heterogeneity in the past 50 years. Giovanni represents one, and for us, if you look into all these communities, one big question we have is to what extent does Giovanni's approach relates to the other one? Is it opposed? Is it complementary? Is it more radical? And so forth. Thanks.
Thank you both very much indeed. We have time for some questions and answers. So if people have questions, please either type them in the chat box. I have some questions, but I think it's only polite if I ask Giovanni if you would like to respond to both of those presentations first.
Wow, you choose. I mean, maybe yes, since there are so many points that have been raised.
Yep.
I will telegraphically answer to some, not all of them. I mean, in fact, if you send me the slides, I would appreciate.
Of course.
Then, I mean, you're right. One of the fundamental issues is heterogeneity, and the degrees to which heterogeneity is put in the model and what it concerns. Now, I'm quite radical on that, as you understand. Basically, I say heterogeneity concerning everything, concerning both behaviors and performance characteristics. You are more productive, less productive. The tendency, even in especially mainstream, is to have one, you are different from me in the sense that you are a scholar better than me. This is the way all the American tradition of interpreting microdata in industry has done. I mean, willing to keep the production function and acknowledging that the productivity is different. Then you say, but your productivity is different from mine. We have the same production function. You have got it augmented by something. And everything that is not accounted by this simple augmentation, you do some kind of the equivalent of a distributional residual, and you say the rest is due to some cost that nobody can see, and when you account for them, we are in equilibrium. I think again it's voodoo. This is pure voodoo, because you are invoking an entity that nobody has seen to interpret a phenomenon that otherwise could not be interpreted. I mean, and this is done in many domains. I mean, it's like, in that case, I prefer more elegant interpretation, the divine providence, for example, or other religious entities that are less twisted around. I mean, divine providence is great. I mean, it can be used everywhere. And the other thing is that heterogeneity is typically of across individual entities that are independent, so you can aggregate. The fundamental point of complexity is that these are interacting entities, so you cannot sum them up. If you have got a lot of heterogeneity, but they are independent, you make distributions, means, modes, whatever, and you characterize this aggregate. When you've got interaction, you cannot any longer, and this, I think, is one of the fundamental divide between agent-based model, appellation d'origine contrôlée, and mainstream models. In that, I mean, is not only a different distribution of information. I mean, distribution of information can go a long way. And in fact, if you take it seriously, you know the result of Akerov, Stiglitz, etc. And are amazing in the sense that they are shown with an instrument that is not apt to do those things. I mean, it's like Paganini that used to make a symphony on just one string breaking the others. I mean, but these are not, asymmetric information is not enough to characterize the dynamics. It is enough to show that the standard system is faulty, but is not enough to answer the question, how does it work then? How does it work implies a constructive model of interaction that is disciplined, as I was saying before, by stylizing the way agents actually interact. Then the diversity among agent-based. Yes, there is. I don't think it is such a strength. I think that some standardization, homogenization would help everyone. I think that we should not be too stick in our own intellectual capital. I mean, we don't have much intellectual capital, fortunately, yet. So we better say, look at the other models and try to learn. And if we have got something to learn from each other, is try to make as few equilibrium assumptions as possible. Even in the CAT models, there is an equilibrium side. For example, on pricing, either it is an equilibrium plus stochasticity that does not come from anywhere. These are, I think, in my view, is a weakness. I mean, I keep discussing that with them. I think we should talk more with each other, with less turf defense on the turfs, and for example, I easily admit that the CAT model is more advanced on the finance side. I think they could take, or we could take, the finance side, nesting it in a real side that is certainly richer, and see what happens. Yeah.
I'm conscious of time. I just want to find out if there are any questions, or there are. and there's a couple online. So before we come to the audience, can I just ask the couple online first, answer those, and then come to the audience? We had, forgive me if I get your names wrong. It's not obvious which one's the first and which one's the last name. It's Hugo de Jesus asked Giovanni, would it be correct to consider neoclassical economics and its assumption as anachronistic rather than outright ludicrous? In other words, at a time and place it was okay, but maybe that time they were acceptable. And then from Danielle Bruhin asked, how are the agents in MAGM coherent with, quote, more is different and emergent properties?
Did not understand.
Okay, how are agents in macro agent-based models coherent with more is different? I think this is the interaction that it generates the more is different point. So perhaps we just start with those two, and then we'll come to the audience after we've answered those two.
Well, on the first question, I disagree. I think it has never been right. It has never been right. I think that, and I'm afraid of a tendency that there is not only macro, but for example, in industrial economics, even the economics of innovation, of taking up bits and pieces of the findings and the assumption of an alternative paradigm and sucking it up. I mean, it's like the Reformation of the Church, followed by the Trent Council. The Trent Council was a way of incorporating bits and pieces of the Reformation within the edifice, the Orthodox edifice. And I'm very much afraid that something like this is happening. I mean, when you have all the complexity of the things that I was telling you before on, for example, innovation, and then comes along, and I don't want to name names, illustrious people saying there is a production function of ideas. A production function of ideas. You have got to be bloody joking. I mean, a production function is a creature that should be killed, and of ideas. I mean, and you have it in even in Philip Aghione and company. I mean, then it means that either they've not read anything about the economics of innovation, or they've not understood it at all. Production functions of ideas. And there are many bits and pieces like that.
Second question was about
the second question is that yes. The answer to the second question is yes. I think that the agent-based models are consistent with more is different. In a weak sense, I must admit. We have not been able yet to have models in which you've got emerging new structures. You have emerging new setups, new distribution of entities, but entities that are there from the start. Maybe it's impossible to do it in social sciences, but the idea in the theoretical biology 30 years ago or so, you had Walter Fontana and colleagues that were able to model the emergence of autocatalytic proteins. So you had a new entity emerging out of the interaction of lower level entities. And that was the autocatalytic one. I'm not.
In the interest of time, I think we better go to the
okay.
I think you hand out. Now we've got extra 4. Good Lord, right? we've got 4 questions, I think. So if you could keep the questions short, Giovanni, you can pick the ones you want to answer, because Muriel's also asked one, which I want to ask at the end. So can we just go in order? Start at the back and come forward.
Well, I understand this context is about some landscape questions, but my question is a bit micro. So in the model, you mentioned that the innovation ticket drawing is according to a beta distribution. I wonder how you interpret that. Does that mean the innovation is equally or maybe more likely to fail or succeed, or if that is the case, it doesn't sound like an actual. It doesn't sound like the actual scenario, because that might be seems like a gamma distribution where the where the innovation is more likely to fail than to succeed. So that's my question.
Let's take Holger.
I wanted to ask one thing about your criticism about the calibration. It's not methodological, because don't you think that calibration is still useful when, of course, ideally you want to have a model where everything everywhere works right, but sometimes it's not the case. Don't you think a calibration can still be very useful, for instance, when depending on the region or parameters, you can have different results? I understand that your criticism was about probably misuse of calibration, when somebody cherry picks some values and you don't know what happens. But I think, for instance, a kind of analysis over a spectrum of parameters, values can be very valuable, because some models change. For example, the policy impact is completely different depending on some, for instance, behavioral parameters. Will you discard this practice also in this context, or it was just was just my question?
Yeah, I think this lady here. We get round. We're going to go this way.
My question is more on the practicalities of agent-based modeling. So we've seen you've listed a number of your papers where some looked at unions, some looked at innovation. So when you're creating or working with a model, how much in detail, in each aspect you go, because then it becomes computationally very expensive. So from the theory to your question to actually getting down to the modeling, just some general principles that you would follow.
Thank you very much. James?
Yeah, in this country, we've suffered from our politicians suggesting that if only we could become an academic superpower or amplify that, then we might solve the productivity paradox that Soloff has left us with. I'm just wondering whether what's suggested here, both in terms of the models that you're developing, Giovanni, and the models that were surveyed, perhaps we need to be thinking about how we put some multi-scalar empiricist skin in the game. I know there's a bad history of navel gazing in academia and using our own stuff to look at our own stuff. But actually, when you consider where we are now, if government policy is serious, that the wellspring for innovation and productivity is actually universities, then perhaps we really do need to address the question of, we've got the Schumpeterian angle, generative AI, and a multitude of other things that might come in and disrupt our business models. We've got the Keynesian angle in terms of fiscal, where are we getting the fees from, how are we getting the research grants, and we've got the labour dimension, not least in younger academics becoming increasingly precarious, alongside the cleaners and the security guards and all the rest of it, but also pensions, where we added our little contribution in the United Kingdom to the Trussonomics disaster, where they nearly blew up 1.5 trillion as they went after the private sector's defined benefit pension schemes with the liability-driven investments. So perhaps we need a matchup of these different models and actually start testing, or do we in academia just leave the creeping professionalization and bureaucratization of our institutions and some of our products from our economics in the government economic service? Do we leave them to make a disaster of the universities, or do we fix it? So should we be putting skin in the game with your models?
Thank you very much, Giovanni. You have 4 questions there. I know we're running a little bit late, and I want to give Mark the final say. And there's a couple of other questions, so perhaps we just be brief on these. Starting at the gentleman at the back.
Well, I mean, the beta distribution is one of the possible distributions. In fact, it's not true that I mean, you play with the two parameter of beta, and you can skew it in favor of success or in favor of failure. And this is one of the advantages why the beta is handy, because you can manipulate it depending on the opportunity in the system and your capabilities to make one or the other. So, in fact, it tend to be more flexible than the gamma, for example. But you can use, again, I mean, one would like to have a discipline by the observation of the arrival of innovation. It's very difficult to have the arrival of the discrete innovation, so except in some areas like drugs. I totally agree with you that calibration, when you want to use it for comparative purposes, for example, calibration, this qualitative calibration is important. I mean, you say you want to compare the Italian South and the Italian North, and are characterized by these different variables, and I want to see, absolutely. As well as sensitivity analysis. A good model is one that is insensitive to some fundamental parameters and is sensitive to others. But the problem, what do you do when you add another aspect? You would like, very difficult, but to simplify something else, otherwise you build the Milan Cathedral with everything. And this is something that is delicate, but it has to be done. We are now at the stage in which if you want to study, for example, product process, you have got to keep as simple as possible other aspects of the model, like finance. Otherwise, it's a mess. And yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, of course, this type of modeling are not everything. I think that they could help in organizing qualitative thought multi-level, as you say. The spirit is that one. I mean, the fact that you have a labor market, but you have innovation, you have the arrival of new science, you have the relationship between science and technology, and these things have to be kept together. I don't think that then you can do it in one model. But this is the spirit of this type of modeling. On an incidental on academic superpower, I think that what we are doing in the West, we are killing the goose that is laying golden eggs. I mean, trying to push the university nearer and nearer to the industry. University should do its job. And I said that there is a book at Princeton University Press, not Fletcher, that is called The Usefulness of Useless Science. And this is precisely it.
We have two final questions, which will be, again, be brief. This is from Muriel Giovanni. Said, could you say something about the facilities and or difficulties encountered by macro-agent-based models when moving from theory and economic policy conclusions of the paper to the concrete economic policy design? So difficulties in going from the theory to the concrete policy design, that's one. And I couldn't resist a question. Muriel, when she talked about interactions, she slipped in the word social a few times. And I want to know what social meant, because social normally means something about society, which got humans in it, and this is a computer program. So is there something I'm missing by the word social? Both to you.
Well, the actual policy design, the jump to actual policy design, I mean, just to be cynical, implies that someone is listening to you on the policy side. I mean, can you imagine the Italian government listening to us? Especially this one, but also the previous one. So it is, we keep saying things that have got also practical policy implication. But there is an enormous gap because no one is actually listening in someone that has got a minimum power neither on labor nor on science policy. Now we have renamed the Minister of Industry. Once upon a time was the Minister of Industry. Now is the Ministry of Firms and the Made in Italy. And I suggested that the ministry should be called the Ministry of Not Made in Italy. What we should make and we don't make in Italy. But social, well, there is a social as much as you can put in a computer. I mean, we want to put as much social as possible. But you have another question?
No, but I'm going to actually pass to Mark to give a few concluding remarks. But before we do, can I just thank Beatrice and Muriel in particular, given the difficulties with telecommunications in this day and age still. And we will thank you in a moment, Giovanni, after hearing the last couple of words from Mark.
Of course, yeah, I'll be very brief in the interest of time. So I thought it was definitely fascinating presentations and discussions, and I've absolutely learned a lot. So I think the event has kind of confirmed again my belief that really to understand the economy and make sure it can deliver the best outcomes for the people who live in it, it's fundamental to understand human behavior and how humans behave and interact in different settings. And in order to do that, you need a tool that can deliver that, and agent-based modeling is one of these tools. So of course, today we were only able to touch on two aspects, but Giovanni's book is of course a much more comprehensive take on the field, and I think it will be very influential. So I also wanted to kind of thank everybody, but maybe we can just double down. So first of all, of course, thanks Giovanni for coming today and presenting. Also thanks to our discussants, both here in the room and online. My co-organizers, Angus, Azu, Marco, and of course everyone who has made the event a success behind the scenes, especially Rehan, our events team, and the AV team here. And last but not least, also thanks very much to all the participants, both in the room and online. Of course, so please don't be shy, get in touch with us. You can send, like Azu and me, and Angus, I'm sure, as well, an email if you want to kind of be in touch. Like there's an emerging network of researchers and practitioners interested in agent-based models called ABM for policy. So if you're interested, you can put you on that distribution list as well. Again, just get in touch with me, and yeah, thanks very much.
Thanks for that. Thank you very much indeed, everybody.